Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Ed Lengel, Chief Historian at the National Medal of Honor Museum in Arlington, Texas, and I'm delighted to host this program for Veterans Day 2021, which is a very important Veterans Day. It's our centennial commemoration of the entombment of the unknown soldier in Arlington, Virginia. And the unknown soldier, as many people do not realize, is a Medal of Honor recipient, as are the unknown soldiers of several other nations. So I'm delighted to have with us Dr. Stephen Trout. He is a native of Kansas City, Missouri, and he is the professor and department chair in education, in English, pardon me, at the University of Alabama. He joined the University of Alabama English Department in 2020 following appointments at the University of South Alabama and Fort Hays State University. His interdisciplinary research focuses primarily on the cultural representation of war in literature, visual art, and public monuments. He is the author of 3 books: The Vietnam Veterans Memorial at Angel Fire, War, Remembrance, and an American Tragedy, which came out in 2020. On the Battlefield of Memory, the First World War and American Remembrance, 1919 to 1941, which came out in 2010, and Memorial Fictions, Willa Cather and the First World War. He's also the editor of several books. I'll only include a few of them here: Portraits of Remembrance, Painting Memory in the First World War, World War I in American Fiction, an anthology of short stories, and I think also very important for us here. Let's see if I can get it here. Scarlet Fields, the combat memoir of a World War I Medal of Honor hero by John Lewis Barkley, which is one of my favorite memoirs of the First World War, and I've read hundreds of them. So, Steve, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
So let's talk a little bit about how Americans remember war. This is something in which you're an expert, of course, and we'll look at the First World War era. For Americans, as they entered World War I and the country entered World War I in 1917, how would they have remembered previous wars? How would the young men and women who were joining the armed forces in 1917, what concept would they have had of the memory of previous wars in American history?
Well, the memory of the American Civil War would have loomed large with this generation. And in fact, we need to think of federal and Confederate veterans of the Civil War as the late 19th, early 20th century version of the so-called greatest generation. They were celebrated at that time very much in the way that we saw veterans of the Second World War lauded throughout our culture in books like Tom Brokaw's study with that title, and in Hollywood films and in civic rituals and all kinds of different cultural activities. This generation in the early 20th century that had fought in the Civil War was venerated by young people, and there were. I think Civil War veterans were understood in terms of offering a model of masculinity to Americans who were born in the 1890s, a model of service to country, a willingness to endure sacrifice and hardship on behalf of a great cause. And so I think we have to look carefully at the way in which young people in the early 20th century were influenced by that generation.
What kind of visual representations would they have seen of Civil War veterans and of the Civil War?
Well, you have a whole iconography that pervades American wartime culture that links Civil War veterans visually to soldiers who have enlisted or been conscripted in World War I. Civil War veterans are featured in a number of posters that were put together by the Committee for Public Information. Also on postcards, sheet music. Civil War veterans often participated in preparedness parades. They often were featured in mobilization events when National Guard units, for example, were federalized and put into service. So I would say visually they were a ubiquitous element.
It's ironic, though, that as the country entered the war in 1917, the Department of the Army was conducting a review of past Medal of Honor recipients and awardees, and pretty strictly narrowing the sense of what constituted heroism. Several hundred medals were axed, were removed from the rolls of the Medal of Honor, with many of those being Civil War recipients, in particular from, I think it was the 27th Maine Regiment, who had received the Medal of Honor simply for re-enlisting. And then some of them didn't even re-enlist, and they still got the Medal of Honor. So those were acts, but heroism was being defined more stringently, perhaps, than it had been in the past. So, as you look at Americans entering into the war, and we're going to look at the case of John Lewis Barkley in a moment, Jack Barkley, how would they have understood heroism? What does it mean to be a hero in the context of what they had seen from the past?
Well, I think to back up for just a moment, I might amplify your comment about the liberal fashion in which the Medal of Honor was conferred during the American Civil War. There were several medals of honor given out to troops on April 9th, 1865, at the Battle of Fort Blakely, which was, in my opinion, like the last major land engagement of the Civil War. It was fought right here in Alabama. And it was a battle in which federal forces very, very quickly overran Confederate fortifications and captured the garrison. And it was certainly not Gettysburg or Shiloh or anything of that sort of caliber. But nevertheless, a number of medals of honor were given out to soldiers in that particular battle for acts of bravery that I don't think would qualify later on. In contrast, I would argue that if anything, I think the military was too selective in terms of the distribution of the Medal of Honor during World War I. If you read the citations for soldiers who received the Distinguished Service Cross, the #2 medal for valor in the nation, it's astonishing to me that many of the soldiers recognized with that particular decoration were not ultimately nominated for the Medal of Honor. Just incredible acts of courage that were recognized with the Distinguished Service Cross, and in some instances, Distinguished Service Cross recipients were ultimately they ultimately received the Medal of Honor. And in fact, Alvin York's a good example of that. If you look at the unit history for his regiment that was published in 1919, he's only listed as a Distinguished Service Cross recipient. So it wasn't until a little bit later that the decision was made to give him the Congressional Medal of Honor. But again, when I look at the things that were recognized with the Distinguished Service Cross, I'm just absolutely in awe and amazed that more of those soldiers didn't receive the nation's highest decoration.
And of course, no African Americans received the Medal of Honor in World War I.
Not until decades after the war.
That's right. In two cases, Freddie Stowers and Henry Johnson, much later, and posthumously.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But to go back to your question in terms of what young soldiers in 1917 and 1918 would have thought about courage, I think that they, I think regardless of how perhaps overly generous the U.S. Army had been with the Congressional Medal of Honor during the Civil War era, there were still plenty of stories in circulation about valor on the battlefield. And, this is a generation of young men in 1917, 1918 who have all read The Red Badge of Courage, for example.
Yep.
And the ironic reading of that novella, which is in vogue now, which presents Henry Fleming as sort of a dupe or a person who doesn't really gain any understanding as a result of his passage through battle, was not the reading that was popular in the late 19th, early 20th century. This was seen as a book about manly initiation and basically discovering within oneself a strength of character and a will that previously had been unknown. So I think that these examples of Civil War heroism really resonated. Let's not forget too that we have the towering example of Theodore Roosevelt, an icon of American masculinity and service to nation, who, if you read the correspondence, and of course you have far more than I have, when you read the correspondence of American soldiers in World War I, the references to Theodore Roosevelt are everywhere. Everybody felt that he was a larger than life personality that they would like to emulate, and much was made, of course, of his courage in the Battle of San Juan Hill and his leadership of the Rough Riders, and again a sort of model of American manhood that was embodied in the Rough Riders. This sort of interesting collection of East Coast sophisticates and cowboys from the Wild West, and people from below the Mason-Dixon line, and people from states to the north. So the Rough Riders and the example set by Theodore Roosevelt, these were iconic elements of American culture that anyone who found himself in the U.S. military in the World War I era would have looked back on.
And of course, Teddy really wanted the Medal of Honor and let everybody know that he had the Medal of Honor, but he too would not receive it until I think 2000 or 2001.
Well, that's right. He wanted the decoration, and he also wanted to lead his own division in France.
Right.
And the days of the volunteer force were over by the time we get to World War I. You're dealing with a much larger, more sophisticated military that just didn't have room for that sort of endeavor.
So you brought up the Red Badge of Courage, and connection that you and I have had for many years is our mutual fascination with war literature. That's something that's fascinated me for the better part of 3 decades now, and continues to do so into the future. So let's look at one example, one which you edited, one piece that you and I know very well, which is Jack Barkley's memoir, which you have retitled In Scarlet Fields. What was the original title of that?
The original title of the published work was No Hard Feelings.
That's right.
But the title that Barkley wanted originally, that you find on early manuscript versions of the text, is in fact Scarlet Fields.
So tell me more about Jack Barkley, Medal of Honor recipient. What motivated him? What were his concepts of heroism? What did he do? And then why did he write the memoir, which really was not much of a success in its initial publication?
Well, Barkley claimed to be a descendant of Daniel Boone, and he came from a rough and tumble woodsman's existence in central Missouri. He grew up not far from the town of Holden. He grew up trapping, fishing, hunting. Barkley saw himself as an inheritor of a neo-masculine version of American history that celebrated individualism and endurance and martial skill, being a good shot, being able to survive on one's own in the outdoors. These were all things that Barkley valued. And they're things that to some extent set him apart from other soldiers in the American Expeditionary Forces who came from very, very different backgrounds, as you know. You have a much larger urban contingent in the AEF in World War I, or in the American Army in World War I, than you had in earlier American conflicts. So Barkley grew up in the countryside. He grew up with a great love of the outdoors and a passion for woodcraft. And this made him, in many respects, if not a natural soldier, it made him a natural member of what was called an intelligence platoon. And this was an organization that operated at the battalion level, and it involved soldiers who had to take on multiple roles: snipers, serving as an observer, being a scout. So we would probably refer to these individuals today as being members of reconnaissance, but the term was intelligence in 1917 and 1918. And so Barkley was just perfect for this kind of role. And this is where he wound up. He wound up in the Company K of the 4th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd Division, and was attached to an intelligence squad, and was just absolutely a natural at it. You needed someone who could stealthily get out in the middle of no man's land and set up an observation post and keep an eye on the enemy, and if possible, if the wires haven't been cut, as they invariably were, send back information by field phone, or someone who could actually operate behind enemy lines, or who could set himself up in a good position for sniping the enemy and remain motionless for hours at a time. Barkley was an absolute natural at all of these things. And he was identified when he was at Fort Riley as being a perfect soldier for this kind of duty.
Did Barkley want to be a hero?
Oh, there's no question about it. There's no question about it. Barkley was he was a born fighter. He was a person who really valued the opportunity to put himself up physically against other people. When he wasn't fighting the Germans, he was involved in fisticuffs in his own unit and getting into brawls with other soldiers, or getting into brawls with soldiers of other armies that the United States is allied with. Yeah, he was an individual who had a great deal of a physical exuberance, and who was not afraid of physical violence, and in fact believed that that was a way of measuring his own worth, how he came out in these various contests.
Can you give us a brief synopsis of his Medal of Honor action? And it's interesting to me how close it is in its particulars to what Audie Murphy did in World War II, really.
Yeah, it's striking. Well, October 7th, 1918, in the midst of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the bloodiest battle in American history, Barkley finds himself working as an observer. He's in a position in no man's land between the American soldiers of the 3rd Division who are moving north, and a position held by the Germans called the Bois de Canel. And he notices that German infantry are massing on the edge of these woods, and that they're going to be involved in a counterattack against his comrades in the 3rd Division. And at the time he's processing all of this, of course, his connection on the field phone gets cut, and he has no way to communicate all of this intelligence back to headquarters. And so at that moment, he faces a decision what he's going to do. He could easily have slipped away from this position, come back to his own lines. Nobody would have thought any less of him. But instead, he realized that there was an abandoned French 2-man tank, a Renault tank, that was maybe 75 yards or so from his position. The tank was derelict. The 37 millimeter gun that would have originally been in the turret had been removed by the tank crew, probably when they abandoned the vehicle. And so he sees this tank, and he also sees this German machine gun position, where a light German machine gun has been abandoned, and there's lots of ammunition strewn all over the place. And so, just with incredible presence of mind, he figures out that he can grab that machine gun, get as much ammunition as he possibly can, haul it over to this abandoned tank, and he'll be able to stick the machine gun out the aperture where that 37 millimeter gun would have been originally. And so he does all of this. And also, according to his memoir, he happens to have in his pocket the belt loading block, which was removed by German machine gunners deliberately, so that their guns could not be turned upon them if they lost their guns in the battle. And Barkley writes in his memoir that all members of the intelligence squad were told to carry one of these machine gun parts around with them, because if they were in a situation in which they found an abandoned German gun, they would have the right part to make that gun operable. And that's exactly what Barkley does. So he gets this machine gun operable. He sticks the nose out the turret of the tank, and he waits for these Germans to cross this field in front of him. And long story short, he fights them off for probably over an hour, and kills who knows how many German soldiers. At one point, a German field gun over on the edge of the Bois de Canel starts taking shots at the tank, and one of the 77 millimeter rounds strikes the tank, and Barkley's knocked momentarily unconscious. And then he comes to, and he goes back at it as the Germans once again are trying to cross in front of him. At one point, a number of Germans were trying to crawl up to the tank because they figured that he wouldn't be able to lower the gun below a certain point. He wouldn't be able to get the right angle if they were close enough. And one of these Germans was hauling a bag of stick grenades. And so Barkley was able to get a bead on the bag and shot it, which led to a huge explosion that rocked the tank and killed all the German soldiers who were approaching him. And on and on and on. It's an absolutely extraordinary story. The German light machine gun that he had was, of course, a water-cooled Maxim, and so the water was he was losing the water in the jacket that surrounds the barrel. It was simply being steamed off. He was firing so many thousands of rounds. And so the only thing he could find inside the tank to cool the gun was engine oil. So you can imagine he's pouring engine oil into this jacket of this water-cooled machine gun. And that causes the gun to start jamming because it's overheating. And so while everything else is going on, he's not sure how long he's going to be able to keep firing at the Germans because the gun's becoming more and more erratic. But eventually, the Germans they abandon their attack. They can't get past this lunatic in the tank, and Barkley's actions are witnessed by at least one, probably more American soldiers who were there at the scene. And he went back, rejoined his intelligence platoon, and claimed later that no one was more surprised than he was when John J. Pershing pinned the Medal of Honor to his chest.
So we talked about, first of all, it's an incredible action, isn't it? I mean, it's just unbelievable. But
Yeah.
we talked about Barkley wanting to be a hero, and he receives the Medal of Honor. He is a hero. But different recipients reacted in different ways to receiving this medal. For some of them, it was a burden.
Yeah.
How did that medal change or not change Barkley's life? Did he want to be a celebrity or not?
I think in some respects he did want to be a celebrity, and partly for reasons that were financial more than anything. He was taking care of the family farm in the 1920s, and Americans tend to think that the Great Depression begins with the stock market crash of '29, but actually the floor falls out from the farm economy in the 1920s.
Right.
And this is a result of the inflated grain prices during World War I. And once the war was over, that market really collapsed. So he was having a very, very difficult time keeping his family farm in operation. His mother was dependent upon him, other family members. And so I think he felt that if a celebration of his exploit in book form were to sell well and bring in some much needed revenue to his family, he would welcome that. I'm not saying he was mercenary, but I think he definitely felt that parlaying his experience into something that would be of economic benefit to his family was okay with him. But then there's this other side of Barkley where he comes back from the war. He in a sense, kind of disappears back into the woods. He goes back to hunting and fishing and trapping. There's a great love of solitude that Barkley has. And so I think, like a lot of people, he's ultimately ambivalent about the spotlight. He's not completely comfortable with this. But by the same token, he definitely was desirous of some recognition, especially if that would be of assistance to his family and to his farm. So I think he was torn on that, like a lot of people.
It's interesting. It was kind of bad luck for him in some ways, wasn't it? Because Alvin York was discovered by the Saturday Evening Post and then had a couple of biographers and was made into a movie. And York was very ambivalent about that. Samuel Woodfield, who I've gotten to know his nephew recently and learned a lot more about his personality and who he was. He was recognized by Pershing as America's greatest soldier of the First World War, and
he was
the pallbearer for the unknown soldier, which we'll get to in a moment. And then had a book written about him, which was full of lies. Woodfield of the Regulars by I think it was Lowell Thomas, who wrote that. As many of these other books were written, not the memoirs but the biographies fairly fraudulent. And Woodfield became very bitter about it. He complained privately that they trotted him out like a circus pony whenever they needed him, and then they got rid of him. And he clearly, according to his family, he retreated into utter solitude for much of the rest of his life, and especially after his wife died, was deeply embittered by the war, clearly dealt with some post-traumatic stress, and died in poverty and in isolation. So it was a different aftermath for everybody. But as we look at memory moving on after World War I, you have veterans, you have heroes, including Medal of Honor recipients. You have others who received different awards, other veterans who went through things and didn't receive any recognition for what they did. They're struggling with their memories, their families, their communities, the nation. As so often in this country, after a war is over, we just want to forget about it for a while. How did the United States grapple with its memory of the First World War and the immediate aftermath?
I think first of all that Americans were stunned when the war ended when it did. The military planners, as you're well aware, were all looking at a likely Allied offensive that would happen in 1919, and that would bring about the end of the war. Pershing was envisioning an American expeditionary forces that ultimately would be much, much larger than the army that he in fact commanded in Europe. So the war ends suddenly. It ends really before anyone sees it coming. And America during World War I think it's fair to say, as a society, goes insane in 1917 and 1918. It's 19 months of absolute national hysteria, neighbors spying upon one another, an action that was fully sanctioned by local, state, and federal government, vigilantism, anti-German sentiment that led to violence against German Americans. The banishment of all things culturally German from our culture to the point of absolute ridiculousness. The pressure on people to buy bonds to support the war effort, and if they didn't, they were publicly shunned by members of their community, and on and on and on and on. This is a war that for Americans at the time was all encompassing. It was completely enveloping. You could not escape from this war. It didn't matter whether you were serving on the battlefield in France or you were back in the United States. This was an experience that was inescapable. And so you take all of that energy and all of that activity and all of that hysteria in many instances, and then all of a sudden it's over. And not only is it over before anyone really expects that it will be, it quickly becomes very unclear what this war achieved, what's coming out of it. And one thing that historians point to, and perhaps this gets overstated, but I think it's worth bringing up, is that the vote in Congress on the Versailles Treaty and the objections on the part of Republicans led by Henry Cabot Lodge over specific points in the treaty, including America's entry into the League of Nations. This inability of the United States, in a sense, to follow through on this idealistic agenda, which Wilson had just promoted ad nauseum during the war. Wilson and his administration turned this war into a holy war. This was a crusade, to use a word that was often in play in American wartime culture. This was taking the energy and the vision of America's progressive era and now channeling it abroad. The old world is coming to the new world is coming to the rescue of the old world. The United States will save Europe from itself. It will create the dawn of a new era. And we look at these idealistic concepts, of course, contained in Wilson's 14 points and so forth. But they're all part and parcel of the way that the war is packaged and marketed to Americans at the time. And so this was not a war about messy geopolitical realities. This was a war about saving civilization. This was, again, a crusade. So when you pitch your effort at that level of idealism and abstraction, there's bound to be a reaction, I think, to that once the conflict is over, and once it becomes fairly clear to people that apparently we've not made the world safer for democracy. We have not necessarily saved civilization from the various evils that we were trying to ameliorate. So I think all of that contributes to this sense after the war of sort of numbness, which you spoke to a moment ago, a desire to forget, a desire in Warren G. Harding's memorable phrase to have a return to normalcy, to get past this war hysteria, to get back to business, back to normal. But I think underlying this too is just a general sense of ambiguity. And that ambiguity comes from many, many different sources, including America's military contribution to the war. Only half of the more than 4 million soldiers who were mobilized in World War I in the United States went to Europe, and only half of the 2 million who went there actually saw combat. So even among, you were talking about the different ways in which veterans respond to the war. Well, there was incredible variety in terms of the experiences of the veterans themselves. Many veterans could claim that they had been through a number of absolutely horrific battles, and it had forever changed them and given them a new view of the world and of themselves. Other veterans had nothing but an anticlimactic story of going off to a training camp, and guess what? They're there November 11th when the armistice is declared. And how do you create an ennobling, heroic narrative out of that?
Like Dwight D. Eisenhower being one of them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And then you add the other thing that gets forgotten in this mix sometimes, and that's the influenza pandemic. Mm-hmm. So we have all of these American servicemen, half actually of the total number killed in World War I, who die of the flu. And this adds another source of ambiguity, I think, and it creates an absence of clear-cut narratives that make sense to people afterwards. And I think this is why you get the lavish unknown soldier ceremony in 1921, because I think there's a feeling that nothing's been resolved. The United States went through this experience. It's not really clear what it's about, but we've got to do something here to honor its memory, to try to establish some way of understanding it. So I think all of those things inform that.
It's a very poignant moment in the American psyche in 1921, as you've shared so eloquently. It's a conflicted time. It's a delicate time. It's a time of very, very raw emotions, and it always moves me when I read accounts of the procession of the unknown soldier from the Capitol building down to Arlington Cemetery, and the people, the thousands of people lining the streets, and some of them breaking down crying, by the side of the road. Family members of people who had been lost, but some people who were just overcome by the emotion of the moment. And then, of course, for those Medal of Honor recipients who were there, dozens of them sitting there on the podium, including Alvin York, Charles Whittlesey, and others, observing this. I don't know if Jack Barkley was there or not. Was he?
I don't believe that he was. As you know, there was a large contingent of Medal of Honor winners who marched in the procession. Right. They weren't among the pallbearers, but they were specifically invited. And I don't believe that he was there. He should have been, in my opinion, but he wasn't.
So where did the idea of the unknown soldier come from, and how did it coalesce in this moment on November 11th, 1921?
Well, the idea comes from Europe. It was an import. It was not an American commemorative creation. And in 1920, you have the entombment of Britain's unknown soldier in Westminster Abbey. Mm-hmm. You also have the ceremony that's the counterpart under the Arc de Triomphe in the heart of Paris, where France puts its unknown soldier to rest. Other nations that we tend to forget about had unknown soldiers, including Italy and even Portugal. So this had become, by 1921, a relatively new but already established commemorative practice in the nations with which the United States served in World War I. But I think there's an important difference between the American ceremony and the United States decision to have the entombment of the unknown soldier and what we see in Europe. These European armies lost a staggering number of people whose remains were never identified. Far more than the United States lost during the war. By 1921, the total number of soldiers who were, we would call them MIA in later wars. That's an acronym that didn't exist in the World War I era, but that's what we would call them in Vietnam, for example.
Right.
The number of MIAs in the American Expeditionary Forces by 1921 was fewer than 2,000. So there were not, literally, there were not a lot of unknown soldiers. Most American soldiers' remains had been identified. Most of them had already either been buried in Europe or brought back to the United States. So put that in contrast with the British experience. If you go to the Flemish town of Ypres in Flanders, and you go through the British memorial there to everyone who served in the various battles of Ypres. There were 3 of them in the course of the war. You'll walk through that arch, and on the inside, you'll see the names of more than 50,000 British soldiers whose remains were never identified, who fought in that particular area of Flanders during the First World War. And you have comparable things you'll see in French memorials and those of other nations. So for European armies, these cratered moonscapes, these horrible, mud-covered battlefields, were places where people just got blown to pieces, or their bodies got trampled into the mud, or you could lose people in any number of ways and simply never know what happened to them and where they were. So I think you need to put the American experience in contrast with that. And what it suggests to me is that the desire to recognize one of the fewer than 2,000 American soldiers who could not be identified, that's not the main thing driving this ritual. Instead, people are finding meaning in it, even if they aren't in that situation of being a family that has no body to mourn. I think many of the people who were so moved by this procession, speaking of a moment ago on the streets of Washington, D.C., were people who had lost loved ones in the war, but whose loved ones had been identified, and they had a place to mourn. Or if it was in Europe, they knew that the remains would be taken care of. And so I think it speaks more to again just a sense by 1921 that nothing's been resolved. There's no clarity what this war is about. And so everyone is sort of channeling their own loss of one form or another onto this unknown soldier, whether they happen to be in the situation of having a lack of a body to mourn or not.
So fascinating. Steve, I have just a couple more questions. What do you think of the symbolism of the fact that the unknown soldier is a Medal of Honor recipient, and the Medal of Honor also having been bestowed on the unknown soldiers of Britain, France, Romania, Italy, Belgium, all of which had unknown soldiers? Why the connection of the Medal of Honor and the unknown soldier?
Well, I think it's one of many ways in which you're having a lavish state funeral for someone who is not identified, someone who could be anyone. And one interpretation of what made this entire event so meaningful for so many Americans in 1921 is that you're elevating you're elevating someone who is sort of a stand-in for the common soldier, for the ordinary American. This is not a huge state ceremony for a general who has just died, or for a former president, or for a member of Congress. This is a ceremony that is just heaping these awards and recognitions on the unidentified remains of an ordinary person, of a person who quite literally could have been anyone serving as a foot soldier in the AEF during the First World War. And so I think the conferral of the Medal of Honor is part and parcel of that, along with all of the wreaths that were placed on the tomb by various patriotic organizations, and the ribbon that President Harding's wife placed on the casket when it was when the unknown soldier was resting in state under the dome of the Capitol building the night before the ceremony at Arlington. Incidentally, that night, it's estimated more than 90,000 Americans filed past that casket while it was displayed in the Capitol building. So I think all this symbolism of honoring this person we know nothing about is a way of saying, you know, the average individual in this war was a hero. Whether we know exactly what this individual's contribution was or not, we're elevating this person. And some scholars have argued that this kind of move, where you're elevating the common soldier, becomes really critical by the time you get to the First World War, because you know you need the support of the population. You need people to understand when conscription is necessary, and so all of those historical circumstances lead to this elevation of the ordinary participant.
And say what you like about President Warren Harding, his personal behavior may not have always been the best, but he gave a really good speech on the entombment of the unknown soldier. I'm totally moved every time I read it.
He did.
100 years have passed now since the entombment of the unknown soldier. And of course, American attitudes toward war have changed somewhat. Maybe not as much as we might think, but they've definitely changed. Our understanding and our means of memorializing wars have changed, and we've only just begun to attempt to deal with the memory of Iraq and Afghanistan. How is the unknown soldier still relevant and meaningful for Americans today?
I think the tomb itself is less relevant and meaningful to Americans today than the changing of the guard ceremony that is performed at that site. That's what visitors go to see, and that's what they're absolutely riveted by and moved by. To the point that I would argue that many Americans have forgotten the connection of this site to World War I. They don't understand that in 1921, this tomb became the de facto national World War I memorial for that generation. It was never intended as such, but that's definitely what it became. Other plans in Washington, D.C. to create memorials to Americans who'd served in World War I fell through, apart from those that recognize particular units or the memorial to the District of Columbia. But efforts to have a national memorial were unsuccessful. And so the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier became, during the interwar period and beyond, the de facto national World War I memorial. The meaning of that site gets modified in 1958 when you have three additional bodies added, two from the Second World War, one unidentified body from the European theater, one from the Pacific, and then one from Korea. At which point it becomes the Tomb of the Unknowns, which is a significant change in its meaning. Right. The decision to have tomb guards was one made if I remember correctly, 1926. And the War Department made that decision under some pressure from the American Legion. The Legion felt that some visitors to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier had been way too casual in the way they conducted themselves in the presence of this site. There were allegations that some people had set up picnics on the tomb and so forth. And so the Legion felt that it would be appropriate to have the site protected. And then by 1937, this practice of having sentinels stationed next to the tomb, pacing 21 steps, going through a very ritualistic performance, really, that gets established in 1937. And ever since then, even when there have been severe storms in Washington, D.C., weather events and all kinds of things, you've had you've had military servicemen, part of an elite unit, who are paying their respects, protecting, guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier 24 hours a day, seven days a week. I think that that notion of someone in the military today um, recognizing and honoring the sacrifices that Americans have made in previous conflicts, and working so hard to get that ritual right. It's such a demanding one. I think that's largely what people are moved by now. I would even go so far as to say that the tomb guards have become the memorial. They've supplanted the memorial. They're more important now in a sense than the thing they guard. At least that's my impression whenever I'm at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. That's really what people are focused on and what they find most moving. And if that's true, that's saying something very interesting about the way that Americans process the memory of past wars, because that's in a sense conflating all of these different conflicts. We're not thinking about them specifically, we're thinking about them as part of a record of American service and sacrifice that transcends any one conflict. And so the serviceman in 2021 who is standing guard at the tomb is honoring that tradition over time of American service, as opposed to memorializing anything specific to World War I.
And it's a living memorial. No doubt, it's not the only living memorial, but it's such a good point that you make, that it's become a living memorial that transcends all wars for Americans. You know, if you draw the contrast with the memorial in Flanders you were speaking about earlier, the Men in Gate also is a living memorial. There are also ceremonies there that take place every day, and the playing of the last post and the reading of the poem by Lawrence Binion. But that living memorial remains firmly connected to the memory of the First World War,
Absolutely.
unlike Arlington. So thank you for sharing all of these insights with us. This is just a great conversation, fascinating. I encourage everyone who's listening in to check out our guest books that he's published. Again, In Scarlet Fields is one of my favorite memoirs of the First World War, but you've also written so many other great books about memory and memorialization of wartime. So Dr. Stephen Trout from the University of Alabama, I thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.